The year is 1584. In the grand, drafty corridors of Whitehall Palace, the air is thick with the scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and the heavy weight of empire. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, sits upon her throne, her gaze fixed not on the familiar emerald fields of England, but on the vast gray horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. To the west lies a world of rumors, a land of golden cities, strange beasts, and infinite forests. For Elizabeth, this new world is more than a curiosity, it is a necessity. Spain, her great rival, is already gorging itself on the silver of the South, and if England does not plant its flag soon, it will be left behind in the dust of history. Into this atmosphere of cold ambition steps Sir Walter Raleigh. A poet, a soldier, and a favorite of the court, Raleigh is a man whose mind operates in the realm of the visionary. He does not see the ocean as a barrier, but as a bridge. He approaches the Queen with a proposal that is as audacious as it is dangerous. He seeks a royal charter to discover, search, find out, and view such remote, heathen, and barbarous lands, countries, and territories not actually possessed of any Christian prince. Elizabeth grants his request. She sees in Raleigh the perfect instrument for her ambition. He is charismatic, ruthlessly loyal, and, perhaps most importantly, willing to risk everything on a dream. The charter is signed, giving Raleigh 6 years to establish a settlement. If he fails, the rights to this vast new territory will vanish. The clock has begun to tick. But Raleigh is a strategist. He does not rush blindly into the mist. He knows that to build a world, one must first understand the terrain. In April of 1584, he dispatches 2 seasoned captains, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, on an exploratory voyage. Their mission is simple: find a place where an English soul can take root. For weeks, the 2 small ships toss upon the Atlantic. The sailors grow weary, their eyes aching from the relentless glare of the sun on the salt water. But then, the air changes. The sharp, biting scent of the open sea is replaced by something softer, something sweeter. It is the smell of cedar, of damp earth, and of ancient pines. On July 4th, they sight land, the outer banks of what is now North Carolina. Barlow's journals describe a paradise that seems almost celestial. He writes of vines so heavy with grapes that the very surges of the sea overflow them. He speaks of trees that tower like the pillars of a cathedral, cedar, pine, and sassafras, and of a soil so fertile that it seems to offer up its riches without effort. To the travel-worn Englishman, this is not just a new land, it is a new Eden. They make landfall on an island the locals call Roanoke. There, they encounter the Croatoan people. The meeting is cautious but peaceful. Barlow is struck by the dignity of the indigenous people, describing them as mannerly and civil, living after the manner of the Golden Age. They trade tin dishes for skins and coral for pearls. In this moment of first contact, there is no hint of the tragedy to come. There is only curiosity and the quiet rustle of the wind through the marsh grass. When Amadas and Barlow return to England in the autumn, they bring with them more than just stories and pearls. They bring 2 residents of the New World, Manteo and Wanches. These 2 men become the talk of London. They walk the cobblestone streets in English finery, learning the language and observing the strange customs of these pale-skinned visitors. Manteo looks upon the English technology, the clocks, the muskets, the vast ships, with a sense of alliance. Wanches, however, looks upon them with a growing shadow of suspicion. He sees not just wonders, but a hunger that can never be satisfied. Raleigh uses the success of this voyage to fuel the Queen's imagination. He names the vast territory Virginia in honor of her sovereign. He is knighted, becoming Sir Walter Raleigh, Lord and Governor of Virginia. The vision is now a mandate. The New World is no longer a myth, it is an English map waiting to be filled. But the ambition of a queen and the vision of a knight are fragile things when measured against the reality of the wilderness. Raleigh begins to assemble his first true colony. He gathers soldiers, scientists, and dreamers. He recruits Ralph Lane, a stern military man, to lead the ground forces, and Thomas Harriot, a brilliant mathematician, to record the wonders of the land. He also commissions John White, an artist, to capture the likeness of the people and the landscape in watercolors, so that the court in London might see what their eyes could not. As the ships are readied in the harbor of Plymouth, the mood is one of stoic determination. The men who board these vessels are the vanguard of a new era. They carry with them the seeds of English law, the tools of English industry, and the heavy burden of English expectation. They do not know that they are sailing towards a shore that will eventually swallow their names. In Raleigh's mind, the colony is a fortress against Spain and a treasury for the crown. In the Queen's mind, it is a monument to her reign. But as the sails unfurl and the coast of England fades into a line of white chalk, the true power lies with the ocean and the silent, watchful woods of Roanoke. The Queen's ambition has set the wheels in motion, but the New World has its own laws, and it does not yield easily to the visions of men. The Atlantic waits, the pines whisper, and the story of the lost colony has found its first breath. The year 1587 began with a heavy frost and an even heavier sense of foreboding in the port of Plymouth. Unlike the previous expeditions, which were comprised almost entirely of soldiers and adventurers, the 3 ships anchored in the harbor, the Lion, a flyboat, and a small pinnace, carried something far more fragile and significant: families. Sir Walter Raleigh had realized that for a colony to truly survive, it could not merely be a military outpost, it needed to be a society. And so, 117 souls, men, women, and children, stood on the rain-slicked decks of the harbor, looking back at the receding shoreline of England. Among them was John White, now appointed governor, and his pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare. They were not just crossing an ocean, they were attempting to transplant the very essence of English life into the unknown. The Great Blue Desert. The Atlantic Ocean in the 16th century was a vast, unpredictable desert of water. As soon as the ships cleared the English Channel, the familiar world vanished. The rhythmic creaking of the wooden hulls and the snapping of canvas sails became the only heartbeat of their existence. Days bled into weeks. The sun rose and set over an unchanging horizon of slate-gray waves. For the settlers, life on board was a test of endurance. Space was a luxury. Families were cramped into dark, damp quarters below deck, where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, salted beef, and stale beer. The boring history of this voyage lies in the mundane struggle, the constant battle against seasickness, the rationing of fresh water, and the quiet prayers whispered during the midnight watch when the waves grew too high. The shadow of Simón Fernández. Every great journey has its friction, and for the 1857 colony, that friction came in the form of the fleet's pilot, Simón Fernández. A Portuguese navigator with a checkered past and a temper as volatile as the sea, Fernández was in constant conflict with Governor John White. While White's priority was the safety of his people and the arrival at the Chesapeake Bay, their intended destination, Fernández seemed more interested in privateering, chasing Spanish gold ships for personal profit. This detour into the Caribbean not only wasted precious time, but also exposed the exhausted settlers to the scorching tropical sun and the threat of Spanish patrols. At one point, the ship stopped at the island of Santa Cruz to gather water and salt. The settlers, desperate for the feel of solid ground, stepped into a paradise that seemed almost a trap. The heat was oppressive, and the constant fear of being discovered by Spanish forces kept them in a state of perpetual anxiety. It was here that the first cracks in the mission's morale began to show. A storm of spirits. As they moved north toward the Virginia coast, the weather turned treacherous. The Atlantic is known for its sudden, violent storms, and the fleet found itself caught in a tempest that threatened to splinter their wooden world. The Lion groaned under the pressure of the wind, Inside, mothers clutched their children as the ship tilted at impossible angles. To an American audience today, it is hard to imagine the sheer isolation of that moment. No GPS, no radio, just a compass, a lead line, and the raw courage of people who believed they were walking with God. The storm was a reminder that in the 16th century, nature was not something to be admired, it was a force to be survived. The mistake at Roanoke. Finally, on July 22, 1587, the cry of land echoed from the mast. They had reached the outer banks, but here the dream began to deviate from the plan. The original intention was to stop briefly at Roanoke Island to check on the small military guard left there the year before, and then proceed north to the Chesapeake. However, as the settlers prepared to board the smaller boats to head to the shore, Simon Fernandez made a fateful decision. He claimed the summer was too far spent to travel any further. He ordered the sailors to leave the colonists on Roanoke Island and return to the ships. Despite White's furious protests, the settlers were essentially dumped on the island. As they waded through the surf, they found the fort at Roanoke overgrown with weeds and, most chillingly, found the skeletal remains of one of the soldiers left behind. The silence of the island was profound. The journey across the Atlantic had ended, but a much darker journey was about to begin. They were no longer travelers, they were survivors on a lonely island surrounded by an ancient, watchful forest and an unforgiving sea. The whispering pines of Roanoke were watching them, and the Atlantic they had just conquered now stood as an impassable wall between them and the home they would never see again. The humid air of August 1587 hung heavy over the small settlement on Roanoke Island. For the colonists, the initial shock of being abandoned by Simon Fernandez had begun to settle into a grim daily routine of survival. They were no longer the proud vanguard of an empire. They were a small huddle of humanity surrounded by an ancient, watchful forest and an unforgiving sea. Yet amidst the tension and the fear of the unknown, a historic event was about to unfold, one that would provide a flickering candle of hope in the deepening shadows of the New World. On August 18, 1587, within the rough-hewn timber walls of the newly repaired fort, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. Eleanor was the daughter of Governor John White and the wife of Ananias Dare, a tiler and bricklayer from London. As the first cry of the infant pierced the morning mist, the weight of history shifted. This child was named Virginia, in honor of the land that Queen Elizabeth had claimed as her own, a symbol of hope and fragility. To an American audience, the name Virginia Dare is legendary. She was the first English child born in the Americas, a biological bridge between the Old World and the New. For the 117 settlers, her birth was more than a personal joy. It was a sign of permanence. If a child could be born here, perhaps a New England could truly take root. But the boring history of Virginia's arrival is found in the stark reality of 16th century infancy. There were no paved streets, no doctors, and no reliable supply chains. Her cradle was likely a hollowed log or a roughly fashioned wooden box. Her world was a clearing in the forest of towering oaks and pines, where the sounds of the wind and the distant Atlantic surf served as her first lullabies. Every breath she took was a victory against the odds. The governor's granddaughter. For John White, the birth of Virginia Dare was a moment of profound internal conflict. He was the governor of a struggling colony, responsible for the lives of over 100 people, yet he was also a grandfather. He looked upon the infant and saw the face of the future, but he also saw the terrifying vulnerability of his family. The island was not the paradise Captain Barlow had described 3 years earlier. The soil was sandy and difficult to farm, and the local Secatan people, once mannerly and civil, were now rightfully suspicious.
The English had a history of violence and misunderstanding in the region, and the ghost of the previous military occupation haunted every interaction. In this climate of suspicion, the safety of a newborn was never guaranteed. The first baptism. Days after her birth, Virginia was baptized. It was likely a somber, quiet ceremony performed according to the rites of the Church of England. In that moment, the ancient traditions of Europe were spoken into the humid Carolina air. It was an attempt to impose order and holiness upon a landscape the English viewed as wild and heathen. Following Virginia, another child was born to the Harvey family, further cementing the idea that Roanoke was now a place of families, not just soldiers. However, the joy was short-lived. As the summer turned toward autumn, the reality of their situation became undeniable. Their supplies were dwindling, the planting season was lost, and they were desperately short of the tools and food necessary to survive the coming winter. A legacy left in the mist. Virginia Dare's life is a mystery that begins almost the moment it started. We know her birth date, her parents, and her name. Beyond that, she exists only in the realm of theory and folklore. Was she raised among the Croatoan people? Did she learn to navigate the sounds and marshes of the Outer Banks? Or did her light flicker out in the harsh conditions of the abandoned colony? She remains the white fawn of American legend, a symbol of the innocent beginning of a complex and often violent colonial history. As we look at the quiet woods of Roanoke today, we are looking at the only home Virginia Dare ever knew. Her story is the story of Roanoke itself, a brief, bright moment of English ambition that was quickly swallowed by the vast, whispering silence of the American wilderness. By late August 1587, the golden light of the Carolina summer began to take on a sharper, more desperate hue. The air was no longer filled with the optimistic chatter of a new beginning, but with the hushed, anxious tones of a community realizing they were standing on the brink of disaster. The 117 settlers of Roanoke, including the week-old Virginia Dare, were trapped between a dwindling pantry and a hostile wilderness. The plan to move the colony 50 miles into the Maine, inland, was already being discussed, as Roanoke was too exposed and its soil too poor. However, they lacked the supplies to make such a transition successful. They needed tools, they needed more seed, and above all, they needed the protection of the English crown. The burden of choice. The colonists knew that someone had to return to England to act as their advocate. Initially, they asked 2 assistants to go, but they refused, fearing that if they left, they would never be allowed to return to their families. Eventually, all eyes turned to one man, Governor John White. He was hesitant. He was a man of the arts, a chronicler, and now a grandfather. He feared that if he left, the settlers, and more importantly, his political enemies, would say he had abandoned his post in a moment of cowardice. He insisted that the colonists provide him with a testimonial under their hands and seals, stating that he was returning to England only at their urgent request to secure the future of the colony. The parting at the shore. The scene on August 27, 1587, was one of profound melancholy. Imagine the small sandy cove, the water of the Sound lapping at the shore, and the lion anchored in the distance. John White stood on the beach, clutching his daughter Eleanor's hand. He looked at his granddaughter, Virginia, wrapped in rough linens. He promised to be back within the year. He spoke of the grand ships he would bring, laden with cattle, grain, and soldiers. But as he looked into the eyes of the men and women standing on that shore, he must have felt the weight of the 3,000 miles of salt water that was about to come between them and the home they would never see again. The herding crossing. White's return journey was far from the triumphant voyage he had envisioned. The Atlantic, which had been a barrier on the way over, was now an adversary. The wind was foul, and the lion was short on sailors and supplies. The boring history of this return is a chronicle of misery, Scurvy began to take hold of the crew, the winds were contrary, and the ship was battered by autumn gales. When White finally touched English soil in November 1587, he was a man transformed by exhaustion and worry.
He immediately sought out Sir Walter Raleigh, expecting to begin organizing a relief fleet within weeks. But he arrived home to a country that was no longer interested in a tiny island in the New World, the shadow of the Armada. England was in a state of high alarm. King Philip II of Spain was preparing a massive fleet, the Spanish Armada, to invade England and topple Queen Elizabeth. In response, the Queen issued a stay of shipping. Every vessel capable of crossing the sea, from the smallest pinnace to the largest galleon, was pressed into service for the defense of the realm. White was trapped. He had the money, he had the supplies, but he had no ships. Raleigh, despite his influence, could not countermand the Queen's order. For 3 long years, John White walked the streets of London and Plymouth, watching the seasons change and the tides go out, knowing that every day of delay was another day his family spent in the shadow of starvation or conflict. The silence begins. To the American audience, this is the most tragic part of the Roanoke saga. It wasn't just a mystery, it was a bureaucratic failure caused by global war. White did manage to launch 2 small ships in 1588, but the captains were more interested in chasing Spanish prizes than reaching Virginia. They were attacked by French pirates and forced to return to England, empty-handed and wounded. The silence that settled over Roanoke during these 3 years was absolute. In England, the story of the colony faded from the front pages of the news sheets, replaced by the thundering cannons of the Armada. But for John White, the silence was a scream. He was the governor of a ghost colony, a grandfather without a granddaughter, waiting for a war to end so he could go back to a place that might no longer exist. While the settlers on Roanoke Island scanned the eastern horizon for the white sails of relief, the world they had left behind was descending into a firestorm of religious and political hatred. The 3-year silence between 1587 and 1590 was not a choice made by Sir Walter Raleigh or John White. It was a period where the small drama of an American colony was swallowed by the existential struggle of the British Empire. The gathering storm. In the late 1580s, the Atlantic was no longer a highway for exploration, it was a battlefield. King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, had reached the limit of his patience with the heretic Queen Elizabeth. England's privateers, led by men like Francis Drake, had been plundering Spanish silver for years, and the execution of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, had provided the final religious justification for war. Spain began the construction of the Grande e Felicissima Armada, the great and most fortunate navy. It was a fleet designed to be invincible, a floating fortress intended to ferry an invasion army across the English Channel and return England to the Catholic fold. In London, the threat was palpable. The boring history of this era is found in the frantic preparations, the raising of coastal militias, the lighting of warning beacons, and the total mobilization of the English Navy. White's fruitless pleas. For John White, the war was a personal catastrophe. He had arrived in England in late 1587, desperate to turn around and return to his daughter and granddaughter. By early 1588, he had successfully convinced Raleigh to prepare a small relief fleet, but as the ships were being loaded with cattle, grain, and tools, the Queen's Privy Council issued an emergency decree. All English ships were prohibited from leaving port. England was a small island nation facing a giant. Every vessel, down to the humblest fishing boat, was needed to defend the coast. White watched as his relief supplies sat rotting on the docks of Plymouth. To the American audience, this is the ultimate what-if of history. Had the Armada delayed for just a few months, or had the English Navy been less desperate,
Mary Dare might have grown up under the protection of English steel. The battle for the Channel. In July 1588, the Spanish Armada finally appeared off the coast of Cornwall. For 2 weeks, the fate of the English-speaking world hung in the balance. The English used fire ships and superior maneuverability to harass the giant Spanish galleons, and eventually, a Protestant wind, a series of violent storms, drove the remains of the Spanish fleet into the North Sea, wrecking them against the rocks of Ireland and Scotland. England had survived. The bells of London rang in triumph, and Elizabeth gave her famous speech at Tilbury. But for the 117 souls on Roanoke, the victory was hollow. The war did not end with the Armada's defeat. It merely shifted into a long, grinding conflict of privateering and coastal raids. The Atlantic remained a no-man's land, and the ban on non-military shipping continued. The years of fading light. During the years 1588 and 1589, the silence over Roanoke deepened. In England, the settlers were becoming a memory, a failed experiment mentioned in hushed tones at court. Sir Walter Raleigh, distracted by his vast estates in Ireland and his role in the continuing war, no longer could provide the immense funding required for a private rescue mission. In these years, John White became a ghost in his own country. He petitioned the Queen, he begged the merchants, and he sought out investors. Each day he spent in England, he knew the chances of finding his family alive were diminishing. He must have wondered, were they still at the fort? Had they moved inland to the city of Raleigh as planned? Or had the lack of supplies forced them into a desperate struggle for survival against the elements and local tribes? The 3-year silence was the true killer of the Roanoke colony. It turned a temporary hardship into an irreversible tragedy. While England celebrated its rise as a global naval power, the very first seeds it had planted in the soil of America were being slowly reclaimed by the forest, left to wither in the deafening silence of a kingdom at war. The year is 1590. After 3 long years of agonizing delay, of watching the Spanish Armada burn and the seasons wither, John White finally returned to the Outer Banks. He was a passenger on a privateering vessel, the Hopewell, and as the low, sandy coastline of Virginia appeared through the morning mist, his heart surely beat with a mixture of desperate hope and cold, gnawing dread. The silence from the New World had been absolute. No letters, no messengers, no whispers of smoke had crossed the Atlantic. On the evening of August 15th, as the Hopewell anchored near the northern end of Roanoke Island, John White saw smoke. It rose in a thin gray plume from the direction of the settlement. For a brief shining moment, the 3 years of silence seemed to evaporate. He imagined his daughter Eleanor and his granddaughter Virginia sitting by a hearth, waiting for him. But as they rowed toward the shore in the fading light, shouting and blowing a trumpet to announce their arrival, no voices answered. Only the crashing of the surf and the lonely cry of gulls greeted them. The silence of emptiness. The next morning, White and his men stepped onto the beach. The smoke they had seen turned out to be from a brush fire, likely started by lightning or a passing indigenous hunting party. As they walked toward the clearing where the 117 settlers had built their homes, the air felt thick with a spectral stillness. The boring history of this moment is found in the meticulous details White recorded. He didn't find a battlefield. He didn't find charred remains or signs of a massacre. Instead, he found a settlement that had been carefully, almost surgically dismantled. The houses had been taken down, their timbers moved. The site was not destroyed, it was vacated. The message in the bark. Then they found the first clue. At the entrance to the settlement, where a wooden palisade had once stood, the bark had been stripped from a large tree at chest height. Carved into the pale, naked wood in clear capital letters was a single word: Croatoan. White stood before the tree, his breath hitching. He remembered the pact they had made 3 years prior. If they moved, they were to leave a sign. If they were in distress, they were to carve a Maltese cross above the name. He looked up and down the trunk. He searched the nearby posts. There was no cross. Nearby, on another tree, the letters CRO had been etched, a hurried or perhaps redundant marker. To White, this was a beacon of salvation. Croatoan was the name of the island to the south, modern-day Hatteras, and it was the home of Monteo's people, the one tribe that had remained steadfastly loyal to the English.
The spoils of time. Further investigation revealed the pathetic remains of White's own life. He found a trench where the settlers had buried his heavy chests of books, maps, and armor to protect them from the elements. But the savages, as White called them, or perhaps the settlers themselves in a moment of desperation, had dug them up. He found his precious watercolors, the paintings meant to show the Queen the beauty of the New World, scattered and ruined by the rain. His armor was rusted through, eaten by the salt air. It was as if the forest was slowly digesting the last physical traces of England. The storm's cruel hand. White was desperate to sail south to Croatoan Island immediately. He believed his family was just a few miles away, perhaps watching the same horizon. But the Atlantic, the same force that had delayed him for 3 years, struck one final blow. A violent gale blew in from the northeast. The Hopewell lost its anchors and was nearly driven onto the treacherous shoals of the graveyard of the Atlantic. The crew, weary from a long season of privateering and fearing for their lives, refused to stay any longer. They insisted on heading toward the Caribbean to winter, promising to return in the spring, a promise that would never be kept. John White was forced to leave. As the ship pulled away from the coast, he stared at the dark line of the woods until it vanished into the spray. He had found the message, but the mystery had only deepened. The word Croatoan was not an answer. It was a ghost story etched in wood. He would die in Ireland years later, never knowing if his granddaughter Virginia had lived to see the turn of the century, or if her bones lay resting beneath the very trees that bore that cryptic name. The disappearance of the Roanoke settlers is often described as a sudden ghostly vanishing, as if 100 people simply walked into the sea or evaporated into the humid Carolina air. But for the historians and analysts of the Shadow Dossier, the truth is found in the physical reality of what White found, and, perhaps more importantly, what he did not find in the late summer of 1590. When White stepped into the center of the settlement, he was looking at a crime scene where the evidence pointed not to a massacre, but to a planned, orderly relocation. The absent houses. In a 16th century massacre, the pattern is predictable: fire and chaos. When indigenous tribes or Spanish raiders destroyed a settlement, they typically burned the structures to the ground to ensure the enemy could not return. But Roanoke was different. White noted that the houses had been taken down. The heavy timber frames, the thatched roofs, and the wooden doors were not laying in charred heaps. They were gone. This detail is crucial. It suggests that the settlers had enough time and labor to dismantle their world. Moving a 16th century house was a massive undertaking. It required tools, coordination, and a destination. This was not the work of people running for their lives under a hail of arrows. It was the work of a community moving their infrastructure to a new location. They were not lost, they were relocated. The absent perimeter. The palisade, the tall, pointed log fence built for defense, was still standing. White described it as high and strong, a silent sentinel guarding an empty interior. If the colony had been overrun by a hostile force, the palisade would likely have been breached or burned. Instead, it remained intact, shielding a collection of overgrown gardens and empty dirt patches where homes once stood. Within this perimeter, White found no human remains. In the brutal reality of frontier warfare, bodies were rarely buried by the victors. Had the settlers been slaughtered on sight,
The bleached bones of 117 people would have littered the clearing after 3 years of exposure. Their absence speaks volumes. The settlers left Roanoke on their own feet, carrying what they could, leaving the rest to the encroaching vines. The buried chests and the rusted iron. One of the most heartbreaking pieces of evidence was the discovery of White's buried chests. The settlers had carefully dug a trench to hide the governor's personal belongings, his maps, his books, and his expensive armor. This act reveals a community that still expected White to return. They were preserving his legacy, hoping that when he finally arrived, he would follow the clues to their new home. However, the chests had been exhumed and ransacked. White blamed the savages, but the reality might be more complex. Desperation changes people. Perhaps the settlers themselves, facing a winter without supplies, dug up the chests looking for metal to trade or tools to use. The sight of his ruined watercolors, the vibrant images of the New World now blurred into gray smudges by the rain, symbolized the decay of the English dream. The boring history of Roanoke is written in this rust and rot. The absence of the cross. The most powerful piece of negative evidence was the absence of the Maltese cross. John White was a man obsessed with signals. Before he left in 1587, he had been explicit. If you are in distress, carve a cross. The word Croatoan was found, but the space above it was empty. To a modern investigator, this is a clear signal. The settlers wanted White to know they were safe, or at least that their departure was not a result of an immediate attack. They were following a plan. But where did that plan lead? The mist of Roanoke doesn't just hide the people, it hides their intentions. By dismantling their houses and moving inland or to the south, they were attempting to disappear from the eyes of the Spanish and the sea, unknowingly disappearing from history itself. The abandoned settlement was not a grave, it was a transition point. The settlers had realized that Roanoke was a land of burning ground and poor soil. They chose life among the indigenous people over death in an English fort. As the fog rolls over the modern-day ruins of Roanoke, it covers a site that wasn't lost by chance, but surrendered by necessity. To the English eyes of the 16th century, the American wilderness was a heathen void, a dark expanse of shadows in the woods, waiting to be conquered. But from the perspective of the Secotón, the Roanoke, and the Croatoan people, the arrival of the English was not an encounter with a superior civilization, it was an intrusion by a small, clumsy, and dangerously hungry tribe of strangers. In this chapter of The Shadow Dossier, we step away from the English ships and look back from the tree line, analyzing the complex web of alliances and cultural merging that likely decided the fate of the lost colony. The Watchers in the Pines. For the indigenous people of the Carolina coast, the English were a puzzle. They arrived in massive wooden islands that flew white wings, carrying thunder sticks and wearing metal skins. However, for all their technology, the English were remarkably poor at surviving in the dense marshes. They didn't know which roots were poison, and they were constantly on the verge of starvation. From the indigenous perspective, the English were a volatile neighbor. The first colony in 1585, led by Ralph Lane, had been aggressive, even murderous, culminating in the decapitation of the Secotón leader Wingina. By the time the 1587 families arrived, the shadows in the woods were no longer just curious, they were defensive. The forest was no longer a place of trade, it was a place of quiet observation. The Croatoan Bridge. Amid this climate of tension, one group stood apart, the Croatoan, led by Manteo, a man who had traveled to London and spoke the king's English. The Croatoan people became the vital bridge for the 1587 settlers. Manteo saw the benefits of an alliance with these powerful strangers, hoping their technology and trade goods would strengthen his people against rival tribes like the Secotón. When the settlers realized that Governor White was not returning and their supplies were gone, the alliance with Manteo became their only hope for survival. The boring history of this period is a story of slow integration. The English did not vanish,
they likely moved 70 miles south to Croatoan Island, Hatteras. There, they didn't live in a fort. They lived in the longhouses of their hosts. They traded their silver spoons and metal tools for the knowledge of how to grow corn in sandy soil and how to harvest oysters from the Sound.
The biological legacy. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for an alliance is not found in the ground, but in the blood. For centuries, the Lumbee people of North Carolina and the residents of Hatteras Island have maintained oral traditions of being descended from the lost settlers. Early explorers in the 17th century reported finding indigenous people with gray eyes, fair hair, and an unusual fluency in English. To the American audience, this is the most hopeful resolution to the mystery. It suggests that Virginia Dare did not starve in a cold fort, but grew up as a child of two worlds. She likely learned the language of the Croatoan, wore the deerskin clothing of her peers, and married into the tribe that had saved her family. The shadows in the woods did not swallow the colony, they embraced it. The English dream of a separate empire failed, but the English people survived by becoming part of the American landscape they sought to own. The price of survival. However, alliances are never simple. By joining the indigenous tribes, the English settlers would have been forced to participate in local wars and adopt local customs. They would have seen their Englishness slowly erode with every passing generation. By the time help finally arrived decades later, the survivors would have been indistinguishable from their indigenous families. The tragedy of Roanoke is that the English were too proud to look for their people in the longhouses. They were looking for a fort with a flag, not a village with a campfire. The indigenous perspective reminds us that the lost colony was only lost to the English. To the people of the woods, they were simply the strangers who finally learned how to live in the land of the whispering pines. For over 400 years, the story of the lost colony was a narrative built on ink and paper, on the surviving journals of John White and the cryptic letters carved into the wood of the whispering pines. But in the 21st century, the search has shifted from the archives to the earth itself. Modern science has begun to break the archaeology of silence, using technology that 16th century explorers could only have viewed as magic. In this chapter of the Shadow Dossier, we analyze the dirt, the shards, and the hidden maps that are finally whispering back. The secret map and the patch. The most significant breakthrough in recent decades didn't come from a shovel, but from a magnifying glass. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum re-examined one of John White's original maps, known as the Virginia Pars. They noticed two small patches of paper layered over the map, likely where White had made corrections. When they used X-ray spectroscopy and advanced imaging, they found a hidden symbol beneath one of the patches, a blue and red diamond-shaped fort. This Site X, located at the head of the Albemarle Sound, sits 50 miles inland, exactly where the settlers had told White they intended to move. This discovery shifted the entire search. The archaeology of silence was broken by a 400-year-old secret hidden in plain sight. The shards of survival. Archaeologists at Site X and nearby Site Y have begun to find the physical debris of English life. They aren't finding golden hoards or massive ruins. They are finding the boring history of survival. They have unearthed fragments of borderware, a type of lead-glazed pottery used in 16th century English kitchens, and pieces of a baluster jar for storing food. Even more telling is the discovery of a snaphounce, a component of an early 16th century flintlock musket. These items are distinctively Elizabethan. They are the fingerprints of the 117 settlers. Finding these shards mixed with indigenous ceramics suggests a peaceful coexistence. The settlers didn't just bring their tools, they brought their lives, and when their English pots broke, they likely sat with their Socotan or Roanoke neighbors and learned to fire the clay of the New World. The DNA of a ghost. Perhaps the most controversial branch of modern archaeology is the study of genetic footprints. The Lost Colony of Roanoke DNA project has spent years testing the descendants of families who have lived on the Outer Banks. For generations, they are looking for the genetic echoes of surnames like Dare, Cooper, and Payne. While the results are complex and often debated, The presence of specific European genetic markers in families with deep indigenous roots provides a biological map of the settlers' journey. Science is confirming what folklore has always whispered. The colony wasn't lost in the sense of being destroyed. It was absorbed. Virginia Dare's legacy is not a grave in the woods, but a sequence of code in the blood of modern Americans. The Silent Earth. Despite these breakthroughs, the earth of Roanoke remains stubborn. The coastal landscape is shifting. Rising sea levels and erosion have swallowed vast portions of the original 1587 shoreline. Much of the evidence may now be underwater, resting in the dark silt of the Pamlico Sound. The 21st century search is a race against time and nature. Every shard of pottery and every hidden symbol on a map is a victory over the silence. We are learning that the settlers were remarkably resourceful. They moved, they adapted, and they survived, far longer than the history books once suggested. The archaeology of the 21st century isn't just looking for a fort. It is reconstructing a bridge between two worlds that was never truly broken, just hidden by the mist of time. As the mist finally settles over the 400-year-old mystery, we are left not with a definitive ending, but with a profound and eternal secret. The story of the 117 men, women, and children who vanished from Roanoke Island is more than just a footnote in colonial history. It is a foundational myth that continues to haunt the American identity. In this final chapter of the Shadow Dossier, we analyze why this particular silence is so deafening and why America refuses to let the ghosts of Roanoke rest. The original American mystery. Roanoke represents the first of many things. It was the first English attempt at a permanent home, the site of the first English birth, and ultimately, the first great American mystery. For a nation built on the ideals of progress and expansion, the Lost Colony stands as a chilling reminder of the fragility of civilization. It is a story where the wilderness won, and where the meticulously planned vision of an empire was erased by the silent, indifferent growth of the forest. This haunting persists because Roanoke is a blank canvas. Because we do not have a confirmed ending, every generation is free to project its own fears and hopes onto the silence. To some, it is a tragic massacre. To others, a beautiful story of cultural assimilation. The boring history of slow integration is often cast aside in favor of ghost stories, precisely because the secret itself is more compelling than any possible answer. The symbol of Virginia Dare. At the heart of the haunting is the figure of Virginia Dare. As the first English child born in the New World, she has become a symbol of innocence caught in the gears of history. Her disappearance is not just the loss of a person, but the loss of a lineage. In American folklore, she is transformed into the White Fawn, a spirit that wanders the Outer Banks, representing a pure, untouched beginning that was lost before it could ever truly start. Her ghost haunts the American conscience because it reminds us of the human cost of the colonial project. Behind every map and every royal charter were real people, like mothers Eleanor Dare and grandfathers John White, whose lives were shattered by the distance of the Atlantic and the priorities of a distant queen. Why we still look. Why do we continue to dig? Why does a hidden symbol on a map or a shard of pottery make national headlines in the 21st century? We look because the Lost Colony is the unfinished business of the American origin story. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth or the settlers built Jamestown, there was Roanoke. Solving the mystery of Roanoke would feel like finding a lost piece of our own collective DNA. It would bridge the gap between the indigenous past and the colonial present.
As long as the secret remains eternal, Roanoke serves as a reminder that history is not just a list of dates and victories. It is a collection of whispers, of carvings in wood, and of people who stepped into the woods and became part of the landscape itself. The pines of Roanoke continue to whisper because they are the guardians of our first secret. The Lost Colony did not fail, it transformed. It stopped being a place on a map and became a permanent resident of the American imagination. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of all, that in the heart of a superpower, there remains a small, quiet island where the answers are still waiting to be found.